All right, so good morning, everybody. Welcome to IGTV. We have with us this morning InfraGard Insights with Mark Cappers, and Mark is going to be talking about separation of duties, least privilege, and the impact on system administration. Mark, go ahead, take it away.
Good morning, Joe. Good morning, everybody. This morning I'll like to talk about separation of duties, the principle of least privilege, and its impact on various system administration and IT-related processes and tasks. Going back to basics, the idea of separation of duties, it's a core security principle. Its primary objective is the prevention of fraud, and this includes, conflict of interest and the appearance of conflict of interest, especially for purposes of audit. In addition, it helps prevent errors, and it allows a measure of detection of security control failures, and this includes security breaches and information theft, circumvention of controls, etc. Now, the way that those goals are achieved are by distributing the task among all the privileged tasks for a specific process among multiple users or groups, or breaking the tasks up so that there are some redundancies and some checks. So basically, the bottom line for separation of duties is it requires that for a particular set of transactions, no single individual or group of individuals who might collude should be allowed to execute all the transactions within the set. So why do we want to do separation of duties? Well, it's considered best practice by security professionals and a lot of government guidelines. Also, if you are subject to regulatory requirements, PCI, HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley all require separation of duties in some form, and that all the applications and systems that are under those regulations require to be auditable, which is the who, what, where, and when principle, and that typically requires that you have different people doing auditable tasks in that process. So several approaches are viable to implement a separation of duties approach, and that is you have a sequential separation. So like on an endorsed check, you require 2 signatures. You have individual separation, which is two individuals looking at something, what's called the 4 eyes principle. A spatial separation, which can be done, it's more in business transactions where you have separate actions in separate locations. And then you have factorial separation, which is kind of a combination where you have several factors contributing to the completion of the process of the transaction. Talking about least privilege for a second, and the two of these go hand in hand, because what the idea is, you're constraining people who have privileged access, and actually this is good to put in all your processes. So any business process you have, all your users should really have some sort of separation of duties and least privilege. And least privilege in the intelligence community, it's kind of neat to know. That's where you hear that from James Bond and pop culture, as well as in the intelligence and military communities. So the principle of least privilege is important for achieving data confidentiality and integrity, and how that impacts system administrator roles we'll see in a minute. The principle of least privilege requires a user be given no more privilege than necessary to perform a particular job or task. Ensuring least privilege requires identifying what the user's functions are, what the processes are, and then determining the minimum set of privileges required to perform those tasks, and restricting the user who is executing those tasks to a security domain or a set of controls that constrains those privileges to those tasks and nothing else. Denying subjects to programs and data that are not required for their job or the performance of their duties basically means that with the denied privileges, they can't go out and circumvent your organizational security policy, which you have just implemented through these controls. As Joe was talking earlier, when you look at system administration or other thing, one of the ways to get to least privilege is the use of role-based access control. And something like an Active Directory, the heavy lifting is role-based access control. We talk about this a lot with identity and access management, and that's why it's so important. Even if you don't have a big IDM tool, the tools are there within the operating systems now to go and put in a role-based access control, and NIST has some good documents as well as SANS, and I'll make sure they're up later. So putting in RBOC is a way to put enforced minimum privileges for all the users, which include system administration, other privileged users, and system entities. I can't stress this enough. When you have databases, application programs, and other things that require some level of system privilege, you really need to pay attention to how those entities are set up and treat them like any other administrative user or other privileged user. So where does all this break down for care and feeding your IT systems? So the administrator root problem, when you buy a Windows box or you buy a Linux or Unix box, they come with something called administrator or root, and those have the keys to the kingdom. And typically, what you have in your IT operation, you need to upgrade or patch those systems. You need user and volume access rule configuration, so people have to go in and set up the Active Directory with the rights, set up the user IDs, set up the passwords, mounting volumes, mounting tapes, mounting disks. You have the backup of organizational critical data, the application database middleware, management of all these access controls, the application development and implementation and support for your applications that sit on these platforms, as well as the network configuration management. All of that has to be done with some level of privilege. So this requires us to then break in those organizational differences. So the way to achieve separation of duties with these types of activities is separate the tasks to different functional groups within the IT department and establish, good processes and hands-off between the groups for complex processes. So getting your arms around the separation steps, you need to understand your functional, process, and regulatory requirements around the care and feeding your IT systems, as well as your data that resides on it. One of the things that we always stress is use unique identifiers for privileged users. Actually, use unique identifiers, meaning every individual, whether they have to be an administrator or root equivalent or not, should get their own ID, and that's the only ID they use. Obviously, if you're in a manufacturing environment, that gets a little tricky at the end user level, so there might be some flexibility there, but certainly for privileged users, you need to be using unique identifiers. Disable your default identifiers. Once you have a set of administrative equivalents set up, go back in and either rename or disable the admin or root account so that hackers can't get to it, as well as if you have an inside threat, they can't get to that. And make sure that you map your processes, and determine where your operational conflicts of interest may exist or may appear to exist, and correct those, and ensure that the proper audit trails exist. And this is very important. Make sure your audit process has an audit trail that can't be altered by those being audited. So again, if you're collecting system logs for an application, make sure those application logs go somewhere where the people supporting the application can't change them. And make sure that your audit operations process is annual or as your policy requires, and that your audit operations logs, make sure you review them as frequently as monthly. And that's separation and least privilege in a nutshell, Joe.
All right. Well, that's a lot of information, but I think one of the things you may or may not agree, and let me know if I'm totally off base here, is that quite frankly, these are some of the basic fundamentals. I think that if people were to follow these, they probably steer clear of what we probably commonly in the industry call the lowest hanging fruit.
Yes.
And that's really what you're addressing here, and I think you did a terrific job on it, because the challenge here is time. All right, we haven't got an hour and a half, 4 hours, 5 hours, which we could probably easily dig into, on some of these issues. And I know I say that every week, but that is the issue here. In 7 or 8 minutes, we cover a lot of area, all right, on these basic fundamentals, and I think you do a terrific job on it.
Thank you. Yeah, and this is one of those, it's a tipping point type of phenomena, because what you see in smaller organizations with less resources, is you have a smaller group of individuals responsible for the IT. They have to have more functions, so they tend to wear a lot of different hats, and it's very difficult to get that kind of mature separation of duties in, and you have to do that from the process and audit angle rather than, for large organizations where you have a group of security administrators who only do user group rights, you have another group that just does operation support of the operating system itself. You'll have a different backup set of users who run, large tape libraries. So when you have a smaller, what we'll call a mom and pop shop, and that's across the spectrum too. I've seen this both in government and in private sector. We did some state government work where one of the department agencies, basically the administrative assistant for the director was the local land administrator, and she, basically took in requests for the users, from the department head, and did all the support of the IT herself.
Yeah.
And it creates a huge appearance of conflict of interest because you have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, well,
within the process.
one of the problems I saw in an engagement I had a couple of years in the past with a small company here in Manhattan. They had about 500 or 600 people, and not a terribly huge company, all right. But the problem was people had so divorced themselves from anything other than their role, all right. There was no role rotation. There was no knowledge beyond what they did in that one box. All right, and that's really where the problem is, because if you have somebody who's compromising that role, then nobody to the left or to the right of that role is going to know it.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's why you got to kind of move things around.
Yeah, that's certainly, that's fraud detection 101. When you go in and you see one person has one job with a critical role and he never takes a vacation, and
Yep.
nobody else has been cross-trained on what he's doing.
All right. Well, listen, all good stuff.